Hi, folks. Ken Cook here, and I'm having another episode. Today's guest is an award-winning investigative journalist, writer, and a longtime friend, Carey Gillam. After 17 years as a senior correspondent for Reuters International News Service, Carey wrote two groundbreaking nonfiction books, Whitewash, the story of a weed killer, cancer, and the corruption of science, and The Monsanto Papers, Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice. In addition to her extensive writing, Carey contributes to The Guardian and The New York Times. She now serves as the managing editor of the new Lede, EWG's journalism initiative. In 2022, Carey wrote an explosive series on the Paraquat papers for the new Lede. And in today's episode, we go in depth about the widely used commercial toxic pesticide, Paraquat. What it is, its links to Parkinson's, to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and to childhood leukemia, and what the internal documentation from the company has to say about its culture of corporate deceit and cover-ups. Before we get started, I do want to mention that when we recorded this interview, it was before some important progress in the fight against Paraquat. Earlier this month, EWG partnered with California Assembly member Laura Friedman to introduce Assembly Bill 1963, which would end the use of Paraquat on fields and orchards in California by January of 2026. Passage of this bill could enormously impact the lives and health of California's farm workers, their families, and agricultural communities across the state. Our aim is to have California join over 60 countries that have already outlawed the toxic pesticide Paraquat. The bill is only one step of many. Our fight continues, and if anyone can get you fired up about Paraquat, it's Carey. Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Cook, and my guest today is Carey Gillam, who is a renowned journalist who now is the managing editor of the new Lede. Full disclosure, that is a journalism initiative of the Environmental Working Group. And Carey, I have known of for decades. And she is a renowned reporter. I have to say, when I first became aware of Carey Gillam's byline, she was working for Reuters, and she was writing the kind of penetrating stories about agricultural technology, in particular pesticides, that very few reporters were writing about. And so, Carey, welcome to Ken Cook is having another episode. I've had many episodes on the basis of your reporting, and most of them have to do with me realizing that as cynical and as wise and as in the know as I thought I was, I always learned things from your stories that shocked me. You have a penchant for revealing secrets, and I'm thrilled to spend some time with you today. I want to tell everybody up front, there are two books you need to read if you're interested in understanding agricultural technology in the detail that it's seen from the inside of the companies that produce it. In particular, one company, maybe one of the more notorious companies of the past 25 years in the United States, Monsanto, from my hometown in St. Louis, now part of Bayer. And you wrote two books about Monsanto. 2017 was Whitewash, the story of a weed killer, cancer, and the corruption of science. And in 2021, the Monsanto Papers, Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice. So welcome to the show, Carey.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
Okay, speaking of having an episode, I want to wind the clock back. You're in your career at Reuters. You served in that role for 17 years, right?
Correct.
And you were based in the Midwest, and you were covering a lot of topics, but in particular agriculture. When did stories about Monsanto first cross your desk?
Well, that's actually, why Reuters moved me to Kansas, to the heartland. I was living in Atlanta. I was writing about big bank stocks. I thought banking in the financial industry was the most important industry. And Reuters asked me to move to Kansas and start covering agriculture and food and farming. And this company called Monsanto, because they had just rolled out genetically engineered crops that were revolutionizing agriculture and really changing farmer practices, and policies were changing in Washington, D.C. to support these GM crops and the chemicals that were associated with them, glyphosate or Roundup, as a lot of people know it. And I thought, what could be more boring than covering food and farming, right? And, I took the job, my hometown. I was born in Kansas City and decided to move back and take this little boring job that required me to put on blue jeans and mud boots and spend a lot of time with farmers and started digging in. And, Monsanto wanted to be my friend. I was writing for Reuters, an international news agency, reaching millions and millions of people around the world. And they brought me in and had me in many times to meet with their scientists and tour their laboratories and meet with their chief executive. And I spent a lot of time there. Spent a lot of time with farmers and agronomists and scientists, and just really starting to learn as much as I could and digging down deep into this very important world that I've come to learn. I was so wrong. It's not banking; it is agriculture, I think, food and farming, that it's the very most important industry because we all eat and we're all affected by these policies and practices. How we grow our food, how we treat the farm fields affects, our water quality, our air quality, the quality of our environmental health, biodiversity, the soil microorganisms, and the nutrients in the plants that we eat. So I've spent a lot of time, as you said, decades, I guess now, writing and working, and have written a couple of books. And I'm no longer invited in Monsanto headquarters or Bayer headquarters, which now owns Monsanto. It's been quite a ride.
So when you started writing, give me a time frame here. Is this the mid 1990s? Is this late
1998 is when I moved to Kansas, shortly after Monsanto had introduced GMO crops in the mid 90s. I just started learning what I saw on the ground over time, and what the research was showing us, what the scientists were showing us, was very different from what Monsanto was saying to the public.
They put on quite a PR push, I'm guessing. I've been the recipient of it. It's been a while since I think they've given up on me. But I do remember it was complete with tours of the facility and the greenhouses and the very high-tech way in which they presented how they developed genetically modified corn and soybeans and cotton, modified to withstand the impact of the weed killer that they were spraying on it. Glyphosate is the active ingredient, better known as Roundup, just as you say. And so when did you begin to get a sense that what you were hearing from Monsanto was their perspective, only part of the story, or maybe more importantly, something very different from what they knew to be the case inside the company?
There are probably a lot of examples. I mean, with the bovine growth hormone that they were giving to dairy cows that they manufactured to help the cows produce more milk, which was causing health problems for the cows. And, that was probably one example. But the thing that sticks out most in my mind, I guess, is when Monsanto was trying to develop genetically engineered wheat. And I was in a lot of these meetings, and I went around with the wheat growers and watched as they tried to get the wheat farmers to accept this and to say, yeah, we want this, we need this. And instead, the wheat farmers were saying, no, we don't want this. And our export markets were saying, if you develop GMO wheat, we're not going to buy wheat from the U.S. anymore. U.S. wheat farmers didn't want it. And Monsanto's mantra all along had been, we're helping feed the world. We're giving farmers technology that they want and that they need. We're just meeting a demand that farmers have. And the wheat issue very clearly laid out for me. They weren't trying to do anything for farmers. They were trying to push a product down farmers' throats. that was going to disrupt markets.
More acres.
Right. And
Yeah.
really cause a lot of problems. And farmers knew it and they didn't want it. And Monsanto was diligently working to try to make them take
Yeah.
it. And ultimately, writing about that really caused Monsanto to become quite angry at me, but they ultimately did shelve their GMO wheat.
Yeah. Well, let's just make sure everyone understands what we're talking about when we're talking about glyphosate. So it's a weed killer. And in and of itself, if you spray it on almost any plant, it systemically goes into the plant and kills the plant. But in the application that Monsanto made famous, when they genetically engineered plants to resist Roundup, that meant a complete change in the way farmers could operate. In the past, they would plant their fields, and before the plants came up, the crop came up, they would go and spray it with a weed killer. There's all kinds of weed killers they would use, including they would have used at the time Roundup. After Monsanto developed a genetically engineered version of soybeans and corn and cotton and a few other crops, you could have the plant come up, the crop come up, and spray it then. So you had a much longer period over which you could control weeds. And you could do it well into the growing season, not hurt the crop, and have these beautifully clean fields with no weeds in them because you killed all the weeds and the only thing left were the genetically engineered crops.
Correct. Yeah. And it was, as I said earlier, really revolutionary. And farmers embraced it very rapidly. Farmers loved it, made their job so much easier, gave them so much more time to do other things than combat weeds. Unfortunately, this encouraged farmers to use more and more of it, right? And they didn't have to be as discriminatory in using it. And Monsanto encouraged them to use it even over crops that were not genetically engineered, to use more of it as a desiccant over oats and wheat and lentils and things like that, to dry out the crops, essentially make them more evenly ready to be harvested. Weed scientists saw very clearly what happens if you spray a lot of weed killer on weeds. Well, Mother Nature adapts and the weeds become
Evolution
resistant. And
happens.
Right. And so then you need to use more and you need to use more. Well, it was a pretty good thing for Monsanto, not so good for farmers who were paying for higher prices for inputs. And this went on to where we are today, which you have so many million acres of weed resistance. Farmers are having to use not only more glyphosate, but whole array of other chemicals now to try to control weeds. Dicamba, 2,4-D. We now have more genetically engineered crops so that you can spray over the top with these other pesticides. It's just become this spiral or treadmill, this race against Mother Nature.
So while farmers are busy adopting this, and it went from no Roundup Ready seeds to practically every acre of corn and soybeans and cotton and a few other crops in the country, almost every acre, which meant hundreds of millions of acres, they were all Roundup Ready seeds, just about, right? It was a huge success in terms of market penetration by Monsanto. But while all of that is happening, scientists and executives at Monsanto were concerned and realizing that there were actually problems with this chemistry. Problems, as you mentioned, the problem of herbicide resistance, where weeds were becoming resistant to the stuff, and so you had to spray more, you had to spray other things. But there was also other science that was, from behind the scenes, very different than what was presented to the public and even to regulators. And you've written about that extensively. Tell me a little bit about how you discovered that, because I very much have episodes around secrets all the time. I'm very prone to secrecy-triggered episodes. And I love that you pulled these secrets out of, these companies.
There are so many secrets buried inside probably all the different companies, right, that you're familiar with and that we could talk about, chemical companies and others. But Monsanto stands out in my mind, the depths of the deception, the level of the hypocrisy. They engaged in ghostwriting of scientific studies. They became aware very early on in the 70s and 80s from research that they were funding and that they were doing, that there were indications that glyphosate applications to rodents in laboratory tests could cause tumors and could be seen as potentially carcinogenic. One of these studies was submitted to the EPA, and the EPA looked at this. This was back in the 80s. And the EPA said, yeah, it looks like this could cause cancer, essentially. I'm paraphrasing here.
Even though it's a weed killer, it's affecting animals.
Well, in a sense, the way I think about it, I mean, all of these different pesticides are toxins. They are designed to kill living things, right? They are. And so it isn't necessarily surprising that we as humans have been living things that our cells could be affected as well. And it relates to exposure, of course, and different risk factors. But these things are all supposed to be disclosed and understood, and so that regulators can make decisions about how these things are used or not used and what kinds of warning labels and restrictions need to be placed on them. And glyphosate, thanks to Monsanto's, deception over and over and over, really has skated through with very few restrictions, limitations, and has been considered so very safe. And, there's been mottos, safe enough to drink, and, all this sort of thing. And Monsanto's advertised it with people in, spraying it around with shorts and flip-flops and no real protective gear or anything.
Yeah.
And internally, they were recognizing, no.
That's not the case. So there were scientific papers that were coming out by other independent scientists and also some of their own scientists that contradicted what they were telling regulators, what they were telling the public, certainly what they were telling farmers. I just have to mention that there was another chemistry that Monsanto was associated with prior to that I'm very familiar with, because we came across boxes of internal company documents having to do with PCBs. PCBs are in all of us practically now. They were used for generations as chemicals that insulated electrical equipment all over the grid. But it was discovered by a Swedish scientist back in the 60s that PCBs were in wildlife and people all over the world. And when this came to light, Monsanto did initially try and cover up, try and hide the knowledge about PCBs, in particular in Anniston, Alabama, where my friend David Baker, an EWG board member, lives. He was one of the key people who took Monsanto on down there. But there was a kind of a culture within the company, even back then. And I don't know that this is unique to Monsanto, but it was certainly manifest in Monsanto, of not telling the public what the company knew, what the company's own scientists knew about the toxicity of these chemicals, whether people were being exposed. It was pretty clear in Anniston, Alabama, when they found deformed fish in the creek below the landfill, that this PCB stuff was very toxic, and it was also toxic to people. Huge legal settlement came out of that. How did you come across some of the secrets that, without asking you to reveal your sources?
Ken, you're my best source, aren't you? No. It was a variety of ways. I mean, there used to be, you can't really access it anymore, but there used to be a great archive kind of buried within the EPA's website that you could kind of maneuver to. And I stumbled across it one time, and you could read EPA documents back to the 70s. And I went through those, just over and over and over again. And you could see the story of what happened with the 1985 mouse study that went to the EPA, and how Monsanto twisted the arms of the EPA managers to get them to change their view on that study showing these tumors in these mice. And then I did FOIA's, Freedom of Information Act requests with EPA and FDA and USDA, sued the EPA to get them to turn over documents, to see the back and forth between the EPA and Monsanto. Monsanto would send talking points to the EPA telling them what they should tell the public. Litigation that developed in 2015 and then has since grown and expanded, turned over discovery documents. And if you go through all of these internal documents from all these different sources, a really clear pattern has emerged that shows that Monsanto not only hid the science, hid the knowledge, that, as you discussed, but actively worked to manipulate the public scientific literature about this product and the dangers. and work to manipulate regulators and work to harass and intimidate and silence journalists, scientists, anybody who was putting a hand up and saying, hey, let's take a deeper look at this.
Including you.
Including me.
Including
They
you.
went after him, and not in a, subtle kind of casual way, but in an incredibly, really aggressive, take them down, ruin their reputation way. And the evidence is really, really clear about that. They joke in a lot of these internal emails and communications about, trying to find somebody to put their name on a paper so it'll look like it's an independent paper. It won't look like it came from us, but it really will come from us. Example after example of them doing that. And one of the ones that just always makes my jaw kind of drop, a very important study that was published in 2000 that was heralded by regulators around the world and seen as a very important paper that clarified, confirmed the safety of glyphosate. Doesn't cause cancer, doesn't cause reproductive harms, just super safe. They had multiple scientists inside worked on for 3 years. And at the end of it, they had a party to celebrate the independent paper that they had all worked on for all of these years and how it was going to be great because it was going to be their defense of glyphosate around the world.
There's sort of two sets of rules, aren't there? There's the set of rules that the companies follow where they have wide latitude to do whatever they want because they don't always play and often don't play by the rules that they're supposed to play by, the regulations and laws that govern whether it's a pesticide, a weed killer like Roundup or the Teflon or Scotchgard chemicals, the PFOS and PFOA. But it's two separate worlds, right? It's two separate regulatory systems. And one of them is permissive and allows these companies to do pretty much what they want. And the other is the one that the regulators expect them to play by. And I guess one question I have is, I'm always shocked that regulators, upon reading your books, seem to treat, Monsanto the same way they did before the book was published. All these documents, this background that the EPA didn't know about and should have known about, that Monsanto was participating in an effort to distort science. What's your sense? How do you talk to people just generally about these two different regulatory systems, one for the companies that's kind of their playground, and the other that's the official one that EPA and other regulators follow and expect that the companies will too, but they don't. What do you make of that?
I think if people don't understand how corrupted our regulatory system is, they need to understand that. They need to come to a place where corporations control not only, the laws that are being made, the public policies with their donations, particularly the agricultural industry is an extraordinarily powerful lobbying group in Washington, D.C. And you see quite a bit of back and forth between the agricultural industry, the ag lobby, and the EPA, USDA, certainly FDA to an extraordinary degree. I separate in my mind the managers, the political appointees that you see at these agencies, and the working staff members and the scientists, because what you hear from the scientist, if you can get them to talk, and there have been a number of whistleblowers, so-called whistleblowers who have come out of the EPA in recent years, they're trying to uphold the law. They're trying to hold these companies to account and to demand rigorous science. But when they try to do that, or they try to put forward papers or research that is showing harm or risk associated with chemicals that are controlled by very powerful companies, they get shut down by their management within EPA. And it's happened over and over and over again with a number of different companies. We know it's happened with Monsanto. We have the documents on Monsanto. There's one thread of emails and text messages and back and forth. Monsanto was very concerned that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, part of CDC, Health and Human Services, they were very worried they were going to do an investigation, a probe of the toxicity of glyphosate. And they didn't want them to do that. And so they went to the head of EPA. We've got the emails. They emailed Jim Jones, who was in the head. You see Jim immediately, within about an hour and a half, email his number 2 in command and his number 2 all the way down. And they immediately respond and start working to kill that probe. because Monsanto was worried about it.
By another agency.
By another agency. And, you think about that. You think if you're a member of the public or environmental working group, an advocacy group for consumers or someone else, if you email the head of the EPA, is he going to act on your email within an hour and a half? I don't know. Maybe he will for you. Not for me, that's for sure.
Yeah.
When the industry says jump, they jump. And that's it's been proven over and over again. And it's a very sad state of affairs that really does need to be changed.
Yeah, it seems like we need, at least by current standards, a much more radical transparency policy for the development and marketing of these types of products, these chemicals that millions of people come in contact with, not just farmers, but as you say, since they've tried to expand the market for Roundup as much as they possibly could, it's sprayed on right-of-ways for highway departments, it's sprayed in forests for control of invasive plants, corn, soybeans, wheat, and then wheat at the end of the season. But mostly oats at the end of the season and a few other crops where they spray it and it ends up in our food. And our own studies at EWG, we've found it in plenty of oat-based products, and including cereals and snack bars and everything else. But we need it seems like a much more radical and public-minded, public-spirited level of transparency if we're going to let these companies bring these things to market. We need to know what they know and when they know it, much more independent science. Is it a sense for you anyway that this is a possibility to bring this kind of transparency into public policy, or do you feel like it's just too tough a pill to swallow for the regulated community and for politicians and everyone else?
I think it's bigger than sort of one change. I think it's a systemic change that's needed in Washington. Every administration, or maybe every Democratic administration, Obama made a big push. Oh, we're going to have more transparency and restore scientific integrity to the EPA and our other governmental regulatory agencies. And Biden has sort of nodded at the same thing, strengthening scientific integrity, more transparency. You don't see that. It's not what happens.
Yeah.
You've got to sue the EPA if you want them to turn over documents. And then you get multiple pages back that are blacked out and redacted, and they'll make every argument in the world. It is an anti-transparent system, I think, that we have in Washington. And, it's more than just trying to address scientific integrity. It's trying to get corporate money and control out of Washington, I think. Consumers need to have a much stronger voice than they do. EWG is such a big advocate and has done so much and carried the torch for so long. I don't know, do we need 100 more EWGs? Or maybe I'm too old, too cynical, but I don't see it changing anytime soon. I certainly, during the Trump administration, there's a memo that I got my hands on. Monsanto was, being worried about glyphosate regulation amid all the new science and lawsuits. And the word back was, the White House has Monsanto's back.
Good to know. But it's not just Monsanto. And just a little over a year ago, you published a very explosive series on both the new Lede platform, and also it was co-published in The Guardian, an expose of another agricultural chemical that really shook things up, redefined what people thought was at stake. Tell us a little bit about the Paraquat papers.
Yeah. So Paraquat, after writing about glyphosate for 20 years, time to move on. But Paraquat is another weed killer, another popular weed killer. Actually, farmers were, one of the reasons that they've embraced glyphosate as they did was because they had been using Paraquat to a large degree. And Paraquat is extremely toxic on an acute basis. A very small amount ingested accidentally or intentionally will kill a person in roughly 2 to 3 weeks. It just is that deadly and that toxic. And regulators knew that, and the company knew that, and they've marked it with skull and crossbones, and it's restricted. But what the company has always said is, as long as you wear proper protective gear and you handle this as we say you should and appropriate, there really aren't any chronic long-term effects from this. But what we saw in the Paraquat papers, and thank goodness, a trove of internal corporate documents dating back 50 years landed on my doorstep one day, a year and a half ago. And going through all those and investigating and really trying to dig in, you see kind of the same story that you saw with Monsanto and the PFAS makers. And they knew way back when they had scientific research showing chronic long-term effects. They knew it crossed the blood-brain barrier. They knew that this could absorb through the skin, that you could inhale it. You didn't have to drink it. You didn't have to ingest it. Just using this in a normal course of business could cause exposure that could do damage to the brain. And ultimately, the science has shown that it's associated with Parkinson, which is known as a farmer's disease to a great degree, even though it affects people other than farmers. And the science has built over years associating this with Parkinson's, but the company has continued to insist that it doesn't cause Parkinson's. And there's litigation going on now. And the internal documents are just so damning. The things that they knew were directly contrary to the things that they were telling the public and the things they were telling regulators for years and years and years.
Yeah. And how does that happen? I don't understand how a scientist, it comes across in both the story you tell about glyphosate and Roundup and the stories you've written about Paraquat. There are some people inside these companies whose conscience, is troubled by the fact that these are hazardous chemicals, and there's some duty, some obligation, it seems, to disclose that. So there is some internal struggle, but for the most part, the business side or whatever side it is that is trying to push away this science and get on with the sales tends to prevail year after year. But who looks at a study like that and turns away? That's what I want to understand. I've struggled with that for years. There was a document that came out of the PCB story in Anniston, Alabama, where Monsanto had gone to the state regulators in Alabama, and they had been made aware of the pollution in Anniston and some of the harm that was being done to the wildlife there, and they speculated that it was harmful to people. The memo was headlined something like confidential read and destroy, right? And it was a memo from the Monsanto experts in Anniston back to the headquarters telling them we've taken care of the state regulators. They're going to play along with us. And this thing should be pretty much under control, this whole PCB problem. I don't know how you write that memo or even read it, put it into the file drawer, close the file drawer, lock it up, and then head home to your family through the community you've poisoned, or in the case of the farmer use, of how you go out and visit farmers and talk to them about the product and what it can do to kill weeds. How do you do that? What is missing in our education of scientists that take that very unscientific attitude toward harm and put it aside in a way that allows them not to speak out?
There's so many answers to that, right? I mean, I think this is the larger philosophical question that you can apply across every industry, every issue, war, everything. What makes good people engage in bad things, right? Or participate or not hold their hand up and cry out.
Yeah.
A lot of things, right? Self-interest, concern for their jobs, their money. I don't know. I mean, are all the people that work at these companies evil? No, I don't think so. I don't think that Monsanto was populated with evil individuals by any means. When you have a self-interest in keeping your head down and just doing your part, you do your part. And there's a lot of pressure. I think of you ask about why aren't scientists, raising the alarm. Well, have interviewed a lot of scientists, who have tried to raise the alarm. USDA, there have been a lot of folks at USDA who've tried to come out and publish, and they have gotten smacked down, fired, censored, harassed. I mean, by their own agency that's supposed to be working for us. So it's just so widespread. And I don't villainize, and I don't want to villainize specific individual people. I think it's a larger system and expectations and personal concerns and fears that cause people to look away when they shouldn't.
Yeah. I think that's right. And, all I can say to folks is if you're out there and you have this kind of information and you pride yourself on your science and your reputation as someone who goes where the facts lead you, I hope you'll be one of the few people who does stand up to the system, notwithstanding the risks that it might bring. What has been the reaction to the Paraquat papers, Carey? What reaction have you gotten from farmers and from others about that series?
Quite a big reaction, and I'll just add to your call for people to stand up. If you don't want to, you can just send me a box of documents. Just secretly
Always
send me
open for a box of documents.
I protect my sources. Quite a reaction, I think. It caused a stir, of course, in the medical community. And I've been told that people in EPA, certain scientists and other people in EPA have been reading it with alarm and looking deeper at this. And the documents themselves have been used as evidence in some court cases that are going on against Syngenta and Chevron right now. And ABC News picked it up, and they recently did a longer segment on Nightline. There's another segment that's going to be running with Al Jazeera.
Yeah.
Because when you see examples of these deep levels of corporate deception, and essentially comes down to how do we protect ourselves and our profit, not how do we protect our customers. And when you see that, it requires a change. It requires some sort of level of accountability and change. And I think there's a lot of people that are
for sure
trying to call for that.
It's hard not to read the stories you've told about Monsanto and the series on the Paraquat papers. I would be very embarrassed to be an EPA regulator working on those chemicals and really see what the companies knew and weren't telling you while you were moving forward with science that had been cleaned up, to put it politely, and then read their internal documents and see that in critically important ways they were withholding what they knew to be the actual science. It'd be humiliating, I would think, for an EPA rank and file regulator, right?
You would think so. I don't know that that's the reaction. One of the top regulators at EPA, who recently retired, is now working as an expert witness for Syngenta to help them defend themselves in these lawsuits for $350 an hour, I think it is.
Yeah.
Money talks.
Yeah. So I have to ask you, I get asked this question all of the time, to the point where people wonder if they should have a meal with me because they want to make sure they eat what I eat or don't eat what I don't eat. How has this affected how you think about the food you eat? And in some cases, I suppose the water you drink, because some of these chemicals end up in our tap water if it's not filtered. What effect has it had on you?
Gosh, so a big effect. I became really focused early on, 20 years ago, on pesticide residues in food, and looked at USDA and FDA reports that they put out every year that track and investigate. They sample thousands of food items and they look for, pesticide residues, and they actually document this, and they put out these massive reports. So you can see that your peaches and your apples and your strawberries are typically tainted, it was not a word they use, a word I use, with different types of insecticides and fungicides and herbicides. You wouldn't have seen glyphosate because they never really wanted to test for glyphosate, and they didn't for years and years and years until they did a couple random years of sampling and then decided not to do that routinely.
The number one pesticide in the world, and they don't test
and they wouldn't
for that.
Test for it. I had so many conversations with FDA and USDA about that. It just made me crazy. Like, why would you not do that?
And what did they say when you asked them that? I mean, we commissioned our own laboratory studies, as you know, and others have too. But what did the folks say when you inquired, why not test for it?
There were two different answers. One was, it's too hard to test for. And number two was, it's so safe, it doesn't matter if it's in your food. So don't care about that.
Yeah.
There was one FDA scientist who kind of went rogue and went out and gathered a bunch of honey samples. I wrote about this one time. from stores around the country and found glyphosate in every single honey sample, even organic. Tried to write about that and took it to his supervisors. He found it at levels that were considered illegal in Europe. We didn't even have a legal limit here in the United States, and they basically just told him to shut up and be quiet and not worry about it until I wrote about it. And then, and then it caused all sorts of chaos. But yeah, so to answer your question, I try to buy organic. I try to reduce pesticide exposure for my children. So we're trying to buy organic fruits and vegetables, especially. You're going to find higher levels typically in fresh fruits, more so maybe than the more processed foods. Definitely like something like oats where they're desiccating, or wheat products. You want those organic if you are worried about pesticide residues in your foods. The industry tells us don't worry, but that doesn't seem to make sense to me. So.
Well, you read the internal documents and there's good reason to be worried. What kind of, I think I know the answer to this, but what drives you? What, as a reporter, as a journalist, my views about this, I think more of us should learn to think like journalists. What would you advise someone, and how do you sort of metabolize the information that comes across your desk so that it doesn't paralyze you? It seems to drive you to want to dig deeper. How do you think that has come about?
I think I'm just naturally curious. I think that all of us should be curious about the world around us, the food we eat, the water we drink, the policies that affect us and our children and our health. So I'm curious and I'm not afraid to ask questions that make people uncomfortable. I don't think any of us should be afraid. I think you don't do it in an obnoxious way, but you're asking questions. You want to know, you want to be informed, you want to be engaged in the world that affects you. You want to create the best world and live the best life you can for your children and your family. And you don't do that by being led by the nose by, institutional knowledge. And so you question and you have a curiosity and you have tenacity. And when people tell you no, you say, maybe not no. So how about this? The more you tell me to shut down and be quiet, the more I'm not going to do that. And that's, a lot of people find it obnoxious, but it works as a journalist. So just keep asking questions and trying to be informed. Yeah. Care about the world you live in and yourself and your body and your health.
Well, thank you for asking those questions and for telling everybody what you found. I have long been a big fan of your work, and I'm just very grateful you spent some time with us today on this program, because it's always a pleasure to visit with you and always a pleasure to get your insights on these important issues.
Well, it's really been great to talk to you, Ken. And, you're the guy doing the work. I just write about it. I write about what happens and you actually make things happen. So
thanks, Carey. Really appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Ken.
Carey Gillam, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you out there for listening. If you want to learn more about Carey's reporting, check out our show notes where you'll find additional links to Carey's articles. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. If you liked this episode, send it to a friend and please leave a review. Today's episode was produced by the team at Full Picture Productions, and our show's theme music is by Moby. Thanks again for listening.